us what's going on, it's Breacher. And conspicuous by its absence was any mention of the LFR. And of course, that sparked several comments and emails as to why. Did I forget? Did I want to avoid the backlash? Well, neither's the answer. Undoubtedly, LFR is always a touchy subject, either drawing hatred or on the other end of the spectrum, anytime it's criticised, the LFR can summon its defenders like Treants in a mundane effort to shame others for even mentioning any form of changes as being elitist, you elitist scum. Luckily, neither of those things bother me though, although I do agree that most of the comments on the topic can be based in either of those camps. I've never really understood why LFR gets such hatred thrown at it by the more vocal areas of the community. Honestly, I put LFR in the same category as random battlegrounds. Would any even low-level arena or rated battleground player consider random battlegrounds to be competitive or organised sources of PvP? No. It's a quick, easy way to goof around, get killed, get some kills, and pick up some reasonable rewards along the way. To claim that random BGs or anything more than that would be an exaggeration. To then go and throw hate at random BGs and ask for their removal would be absurd. They harm no one and provide a place for people to PvP without going the extra mile in finding a spot on a regular team for the alternatives. So, why is it that LFR gets that treatment? Well, for one, it joined the game at a much later time, whereas BGs were in vanilla. Before the LFR, though, many players had to engage in the organised versions of raiding with a guild, or they just didn't raid at all. So when the LFR came in, those raiders stepped inside to check it out and found nothing but a total disaster. If we look at the first iteration of LFR, which was the Dragon Soul, raiders couldn't help but find it laughable what Blizzard had created as content. Like Morchok's Black Blood couldn't kill you, Warlord's Honor's tennis ball mechanic was automated, and hilariously Hagar's Lightning Storm was carried around the room by the raid in a big ball of unorganised mess. As such, the LFR instantaneously earned the title of Moronic Super Easy Mode. You would think then that raiders would have left it there and bundled it in with content like 5-man dungeons, but no. Unfortunately, Dragon Soul had some of the most powerful set bonuses for tanks that had ever been in the game. This made running LFR mandatory. Nothing breeds hate more than feeling forced to do content which is unsuitable for you and your friends. I mentioned the introduction of LFR for the sole reason that from its first day, it received, and rightly so, almost complete disdain from the raiding community, from which it would never recover. Now, no, I didn't say everyone. In fact, a majority did welcome the LFR. For those who could never find a raid guild, or those who no longer had time to invest in it, they had a new way of seeing the final boss of the expansion, in this case, his hands. A boss which had burned them in the open world and been the subject of every major quest and cutscene up until that point. But they could also gain tier sets, which many non-raiders had coveted for so long when inspecting other players. For many, the LFR is raiding, and anyone saying it isn't is apparently just salty and elitist. So having said that, is there a reason to hate LFR? Not really. If you're raiding at a level above LFR, there is no reason to use it, so it shouldn't bother you at all. Blizzard has gone to great lengths since its first inception to drive that point home. The items are not even close to those acquired in an actual raid, or even in the open world. Does that mean then that I think LFR is fine? No. The implementation of the system seems to be a big problem for me, not the system itself. This is where LFR deviates from random battlegrounds. Random BGs do not have a level of progression that equates to a raiding dungeon. The battlegrounds at launch, or even those launched a decade ago, are the same as they are today. There is no route for completion in a BG or any form of challenge to overcome in the environment itself. Raid instances don't work that way. Each step along the path requires you, for the most part, to overcome a challenge in order to access the next part. The current LFR system removes progression from the system far too early in a content's lifecycle. The effect of this is removing any and all incentive for players to enter the raiding world, as there is perceivably no point, and therein many players are stuck in the circle jerk, which in a general sense creates a weak, toxic and deflating experience of WoW's endgame. Now, this is entirely based on the feedback I receive from new players looking into joining the raiding community and the challenges they face, as well as some of the larger forum complaints about players' lackluster experience. So, let me explain the circle jerk as I see it. Let's get a player, our man, who is not in an active raiding guild and as such is likely under the impression that item level is a key component of moving up or even in a more base level, simply believes that LFR and such is raiding, but there are better, more rewarding loots elsewhere. It's just their item level holding them back. So they look to improve gear, with limited options available. So they go to the LFR, they craft items, and they do world bosses in order to meet some of the more ridiculous item level requirements of the pre-made group finder. Now at this point in the Circle Jerk, our man sees everything he does as both easy, as in most cases the content is defeated, accessible, as he doesn't even need to rely or speak to anyone in order to progress his character, and above all, he is using the most efficient and simple methods available to reach his goals. Unbeknownst to him though, it's plainly obvious to those of us who have broken out the Circle Jerk, it's actually the slowest and most inefficient method of progress in the game. Not only that, but in most cases, extremely unrewarding compared to the challenges they could be facing. I'm not saying that each step towards their goal is unrewarding, as it most certainly is within the Circle. The point is, every rewarding step they take takes orders of magnitude longer than a normal raiding guild could make in a single evening. So our man now tries the pre-made group finder, eventually reaching a suitable item level. For now, we'll ignore the achieve requirements as that's a symptom of the system, not really the problem. This is our first taste of what has been called real raiding. As you all know, the pug system is often slower, more incompetent and problematic than LFR. There are many successful pugs, of course, but they are the minority in comparison to the ones that take a hell of a long time to start, need replacements, have rage chats, or leadership's strange loot rules and generally peter out before clearing a significant portion of the dungeon. At this point, our player will choose to either go back to the easier, less painful options he's already been doing, forming the smaller circle, they'll quit, or they'll try and join a raid guild. Our player then looks at a raid guild requirements, assuming they don't quit as they see them immediately as it looks absurd. They're asked about history, experience, logs and so on. All things unattainable or foreign. It's not easy to get history if you have none, and most people won't go to the effort of figuring out how to get logs. It always saddens me as even a guild with limited experience can use a log of LFR in order to assess if a player is worth it or not. But anyway. The next step is to go on a different road, which in most cases the guilds formed through trade chat with little to no requirements. There is always a chance that this will end well, but it's a low chance. More often than not, these guilds recruit anyone they can simply to have enough people to make a raid that evening or next week, and collapse shortly after due to low preparation or vetting of the players. Regardless of whether or not our player contributed to the failure or not, it can be agreed that the experience wasn't enjoyable and once again required much more time and effort versus rewards than simply joining an LFR. The final step in the Circle Jerk is that too much time has passed this tier to have any chance of joining a decent guild, and so we'll forgo it until the next tier where we'll take a fresh start. This brings us to completing the circle. Due to the amount of time required to achieve very little, it's perceived that breaking out the circle is just a tier away, when in fact it never is by simply repeating the process. Now, as you can see then, the above process is very easy to fall into and leads to low to non-existent progression. It's extremely laborious, which is something that is more commonly known than it once was. In WoW's early days, it was considered that the top-end raiders must be playing longer than anyone else to reach that level. It was common to see them tagged as no-lifers. While it's true, certain aspects of the game once needed no-lifing, it's not a phrase we really see anymore, mainly due to the prevalence of things like live streaming. It's pretty clear that the top-end players play at worst equally as much as the average player, but more likely, considerably less. In regards to those of you who are thinking, how do you break out of the circle? I've linked some videos below which will help you out. The current implementation of LFR endorses the circle. That's why I dislike it. The cynic in me could look at the current system and say Blizz intends it to be this way, as the laborious nature of the Circle Jerk keeps people playing, spinning the wheel, and running the treadmill never-endingly. However, I choose to believe that Blizz would prefer players who are having a satisfying, rewarding experience, and they will continue to play for a longer time than those being bogged down in frustration. The first thing LFR could change is simply its release date. LFR is intended to be the tourist mode, and by definition, it is not meant to be a challenge, something which many players don't seem to understand. Expecting a challenge inside the LFR is your mistake, not the game's. Its sole existence is to allow players who cannot access that content via its intended method a chance to see what raiders have been toiling away at. Hence, it's always bothered me since its inception that LFR uses current content. If the idea of LFR is to show players what they have been missing, then why show it when it's just come out? It's difficult to feel like you're missing content when you don't have time to miss it. It stands to reason that it certainly removes some incentive to try and break out of the circle, as the mystery surrounding a new raid is lost. It seems logical to me that the tourist mode should come when the next tier is released. For example, High Mall LFR would come when Blackrock Foundry releases. Ultimately, the Hellfire Citadel LFR would come at an appropriate time towards the end of the expansion. A big argument against any criticism of LFR is that by altering it, you risk denying players content. I hope so far I have shown that I really have no problem with LFR, and I certainly do not wish to deny players content. At the same time, it's idiotic to ignore some of the obvious issues the current system creates. By granting immediate access to every single piece of content in the game, then consumption and burnout is far more prevalent, as well as the obvious subscribe, unsubscribe technique so readily in use today, which benefits no one. So some will argue gear shouldn't drop and so on and so on and so on. I don't believe LFR rewarding reasonable catch-up gear is a problem. Given the time invested, it is okay to have gear rewards, and epic being epic is something that hasn't existed since mid-vanilla, and it's about time players stop regurgitating it ad nauseum. Some may say that by the second tier of raiding, LFR would be available and we're back to square one. Not true. Given that there will always be some content which needs that little bit more to access without having to wait a significant amount of time, I believe it's enough to provide motivation to seek out alternative routes beyond that of opening the dungeon queue menu. The conclusion I have for this is, why do I care? Why do I care what other people are doing? It's not wrong to ask me that, honestly. It's a good question. It doesn't bother me in the slightest if a player chooses to do LFR, which is why I have trouble understanding the toxicity some people feel for it. If you're not taking part of it, why does it bother you? However, my answer is that I believe WoW has far more to offer than what is presented as its easiest option. I can safely say that WoW has given me my greatest moments in gaming, and not a single one of them took place in an area of the game I could randomly queue for. And I like to set a player on a course that will allow others and people like them to have those experiences for themselves. That's my thoughts on LFR. I don't hate it. It could just use some tweaking, that's all.